Hello, my name is Henry Heinz Spearing. Behind the camera is Alonso Saavedra.
My name is Fernando Martin. The day is December 14th, 2023 at 4:30. We're going to be interviewing Mr. Kostenko.
What is your full name?
James John Kostenko.
Could you describe the neighborhood that you lived in?
So I was born on the near south side. I don't have a lot of recollection of that. So that was roughly 13th in Oklahoma, 13th in Harrison. I lived there until I was about 2 years old, and then we moved to Greendale. So I spent most of my younger years in Greendale.
Was your last name popular in the area you lived in?
What was that?
Was your name popular, last name popular in the
Not at all. In fact, I didn't meet another Kostenko until someone actually came to the door of our house. I think I was maybe 15 years old, and because I think the name was so odd at that time across the United States, he somehow had heard that there were Kostenkos living in that house, and he stopped by. I don't know how he found that out, but my recollection is he was from South Dakota. So I don't know if he knew somebody in the neighborhood and they had said there's another Kostenko in the neighborhood. But other than that, I can't remember until I was in graduate school and started to do research and then recognized the name and some of the research that I was doing.
What descent are you, like your background?
What's that?
So what's your background? Like, are you German, Polish?
So my grandfather and my dad's side came from what is currently Belarus. So he referred to that as White Russia, which I believe is the translation of Belarus. If I remember, my grandmother on my dad's side was from Poland. And then my grandmother and grandfather on my mom's side were mainly Polish and just a little bit of German.
Awesome. And growing up, could you describe the friend group that you had?
So, growing up as a baby boomer in the suburbs, there were just loads of kids. So there were so many kids in the neighborhood that you could essentially form, a relatively small sports team playing baseball in the neighborhood, basketball, and football within about 4 or 5 houses of your own house. So within a half a block either way, I probably had 10 friends in that neighborhood. So after school and during summertime, it was mainly hanging out with the other guys in the neighborhood. During the school years, certainly at school, then I had, a lot of school friends.
What middle school did you go to?
So I went to public school only in kindergarten and first grade, and then I went to St. Alphonsus in Greendale, 2nd through 8th. And then after 8th grade, I went to Greendale High School.
Do you remember the name of the public school?
Ambrewster.
Why did you switch schools?
Well, my folks wanted me to go to a Catholic grade school, and at that time, St. Alphonsus didn't have a first grade, so I would have gone there K and first grade if they would have had those classes.
How did you feel about that change?
So many of my friends went on to St. Alphonsus at that point that I don't recall that it was a real big transition. I mean, I certainly went into a school as a second grader where I didn't know a good number of kids in my class, but I just remember making friends quickly, and in fact still have 3 or 4 friends from second grade that actually I still get together with at least a couple of times a year.
What are some of the sports that you played during middle school?
So in grade school, I remember playing basketball. We played flag football rather than tackle, and then also played baseball.
Was it all boys or was it
No, it was co-ed.
co-ed?
Yep.
Um, you said that you went through St. Alfonso's 2nd through 8th grade.
Yes.
What high school did you go to after?
Greendale High School.
All right. What is your full name?
James John Kostenko.
Could you describe the neighborhood that you lived in?
So I was born on the near south side. I don't have a lot of recollection of that. So that was roughly 13th in Oklahoma, 13th in Harrison. I lived there until I was about 2 years old, and then we moved to Greendale. So I spent most of my younger years in Greendale.
Was your last name popular in the area you lived in?
What was that?
Was your name popular, last name popular in the?
Not at all. In fact, I didn't meet another Kostenko until someone actually came to the door of our house. I think I was maybe 15 years old, and because I think the name was so odd at that time across the United States, he somehow had heard that there were Kostenkos living in that house, and he stopped by. I don't know how he found that out, but my recollection is he was from South Dakota. So I don't know if he knew somebody in the neighborhood, and they had said there's another Kostenko in the neighborhood. But other than that, I can't remember until I was in graduate school and started to do research, and then recognized the name and some of the research that I was doing.
What's your, what descent are you, like your background?
What's that?
So what's your background, like are you German, Polish?
So my grandfather and my dad's side came from what is currently Belarus. So he referred to that as White Russia, which I believe is the translation of Belarus. If I remember, my grandmother on my dad's side was from Poland. And then my grandmother and grandfather on my mom's side were mainly Polish and just a little bit of German.
Awesome. And growing up, could you describe the friend group that you had?
So, growing up as a baby boomer in the suburbs, there were just loads of kids. So there were so many kids in the neighborhood that you could essentially form, a relatively small sports team playing baseball in the neighborhood, basketball, and football within about 4 or 5 houses of your own house. So within a half a block either way, I probably had 10 friends in that neighborhood. So after school and during summertime, it was mainly hanging out with the other guys in the neighborhood. During the school years, certainly at school, then I had, a lot of school friends.
What middle school did you go to?
So I went to public school only in kindergarten and first grade, and then I went to St. Alphonsus in Greendale, 2nd through 8th. And then after 8th grade, I went to Greendale High School.
Do you remember the name of the public school?
Brewster.
Why did you switch schools?
Well, my folks wanted me to go to a Catholic grade school, and at that time, St. Alphonsus didn't have a first grade, so I would have gone there K and first grade if they would have had those classes.
How did you feel about that change?
So many of my friends went on to St. Alphonsus at that point that I don't recall that it was a real big transition. I mean, I certainly went into a school as a second grader where I didn't know a good number of kids in my class, but I just remember making friends quickly, and in fact still have 3 or 4 friends from second grade that actually I still get together with at least a couple of times a year.
What are some of the sports that you played during middle school?
So in grade school, I remember playing basketball. We played flag football rather than tackle. and then also played baseball.
Was it all boys or was it
No, it was co-ed.
co-ed?
Yep.
Um, you said that you went through St. Alfonso's 2nd through 8th grade.
Yes.
What high school did you go to after?
Greendale High School.
In Greendale High School, did a lot of your friends transfer over?
They did. So, I mean, I can remember a couple of good friends in 8th grade at St. Alphonsus. Definitely remember one or two guys from my class that actually came here to Marquette High. And then probably a couple of guys went to what's now St. Thomas More High School on the south side. And then also a few would have gone to Pius High School. But most of them actually ended up, my closest friends ended up going to Greendale High School.
What did you think about Greendale High School?
I have fond memories for sure. So I believe that my 8th grade class was the biggest class ever at St. Alphonsus. That was 100, and I think it was 119 or 120 graduates. And then when I went to high school, I think we, to this day, might have been the biggest graduating class at Greendale High School. In my recollection there, we had, I think, close to 400 graduating at that time. So we were kind of that biggest. So I was born in 1957, and at least in Greendale, that was probably the year that, you know, was obviously the most students at St. Alphonsus. So I don't know if that was sort of countrywide, but definitely 1957 would have been a big boomer year.
Did the Vietnam War heavily affect you since you were around in that?
I mean, I don't have the earliest recollection. So I was thinking, you know, trying to go back to my earliest recollection, and a couple of things stand out. In 1961, the beginning of the American astronauts in outer space. So the first American astronaut, Alan Shepard, in May of 1961. So I would have been 4 years old at that time. I do have vague recollection of that. And then in 1962, definitely have some recollection of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, I can remember having this sense that there were times during that, I think it was roughly a 10-day period, that my parents were putting us to bed with this thought that there might not be a morning. So, you know, as a youngster, 5 years old, how would I, you know, have that recollection? But I definitely can remember, you know, even in the late 60s, going through the 70s until this time, just always having that recollection that there was this definite sense of doom at that time. And then probably my first recollection of the Vietnam War would have been when we became more heavily involved in the war and watching the nightly news and watching reports on that. And the other part to that recollection that definitely had an impact on me is quite frequently they would show video that included body bags. So fallen soldiers, American soldiers at that time, and I definitely remember that being somewhat traumatic.
What do you think about the war?
So at the time, you know, when I'm 10 years old or younger, or right around that time, I don't really have too much recollection of how I felt about the war. But as I moved into my teens, and definitely being more aware and being more interested in national and international news, and because the anti-war movement, to my recollection, was in full gear at the end of the 60s, early 70s, watching that on the news definitely had an impact. I've got an older brother, two older sisters. My sister Pat is 4 years older, sister Sue is 7 years older, and I don't recall that they actually, maybe my older sister Sue might have gone to one or two anti-war marches, but I mean, I definitely, that was starting to hit closer to home. And then also hanging out with some guys a bit older than myself, if they weren't directly involved as being drafted, they had older brothers or older cousins. I definitely have recollection of that. So then it became a bit more real. And then I can remember, spending some anxious time thinking, well, I might get drafted in a few years. And by that time, I was definitely against the war and thinking that certainly one of my possible options was leaving the country to go to Canada.
Did the war have any effect on Milwaukee as a whole?
I don't recall, other than there would have been marches in Milwaukee to my recollection. I know that there were, because my older sister was involved in this at UW Milwaukee, there were student walkouts at UW Milwaukee where they didn't go to class and they would protest in some of the big common areas on campus. That was going on across the country. So that would have been occurring in Milwaukee. Not in Milwaukee, but close. I definitely remember the bombing of the chemistry building on the UW Madison campus. And if my memory is correct, I think that was in 1972 that happened.
Did that cause a lot of worry in your life?
So my recollection is that, when I think of the current climate and the division in the country now, there's part of me that thinks, oh my gosh, it's never been this bad. But then I think back to the late 60s and early 70s, and UW-Madison was not the only bombing incident in the United States. And thank God we really haven't had that happen since then. So, certainly the division at that time was, at least to the extent where there was, there were these violent episodes that were occurring, which certainly were unnerving and anxiety-provoking. And then as I got to high school and closer to my senior year, in the age of 18, having to register for the draft at 18, seeing my brother do that, seeing my sister's boyfriends do that. My brother, a year older in school, actually did register for the draft. And then it was, I think it was, might have been January 1st of 1975 that registration for the draft ended. So I never had to register for the draft.
Just backtracking a little bit, what was your family life like?
So I was the youngest of four. We lived in a small three-bedroom ranch in Greendale. Although when that's your history and that's your day-to-day experience, I mean, it didn't seem crowded. Within the last 10 years, when my mom moved out, and she finally sold the house, I mean, I can remember going back to the house, getting it ready for sale, and just thinking, how the heck did 6 people, 4 young kids grow up in such a small house? But, I mean, somehow you do it. We had a bath and a half and relatively small kitchen, but we all fit around the kitchen table. So, I mean, my recollection of family life is more the sort of day-to-day and sort of season-to-season. As a kid, you have markers of going from one grade to the next. So when I think of growing up in Greendale, it's really more about the friends that I hung out with rather than, a lot of memories of actual life in that house.
Were you and your friends more of a rule-following group, or were you a little bit rebellious?
I mean, I would say that we were a little bit of both. I mean, we definitely pushed it, but sort of knew how far to take it. I mean, do I look back and think some things were just sort of stupid? I don't think we ever did things where it put, anybody's safety, either ourselves or folks in the neighborhood, for example, in, any sort of danger. Certainly did some things where if you guys did those things today and got caught, the consequences for that would be, more severe, I would say.
Are you comfortable sharing one of those stories?
Well, I mean, I remember it was quite common back in the day to snowball cars. So I don't know if that still goes on today, but my guess is that getting caught for that. I can remember one time we were caught by the Milwaukee police. We were put in the squad car. He took information down, definitely talked to us about the dangers of doing that. We thought for sure he was going to call our parents. He said he was going to call our parents, and I think he just sort of saw that, his intent to scare us was good enough. So my parents never got the call. We were relieved for that.
Were you always waiting for the ring?
I mean, for a few days, definitely, we're waiting for the ring. So, sure, that, I say we never really did anything dangerous. I suppose that, just if you combine doing something stupid with bad luck, that, I would say that to my students here at Marquette High for years. Doing something stupid with bad luck, without the bad luck, you're probably going to get away with it. But combining the two together, it could have more severe consequences. So luckily, that combination never seemed to happen to me.
So how does the Milwaukee police from then compare to the police now?
So, I mean, I grew up in Greendale, and I would say that at that time in the 60s and 70s, what they had to deal with was probably mainly, watching for speeders, maybe once in a while a burglary. I would say the city of Milwaukee, my recollection just from watching the local news and reading the paper, certainly they were, dealing with more severe crimes. I do definitely have, I think anybody that grew up at that time has recollection of Police Chief Harold Breyer, who was the police chief for decades in Milwaukee. And he definitely ruled with an iron hand, is my recollection. So I don't know if you guys talked about him in Milwaukee history, but certainly, sort of running the department that way nowadays wouldn't be tolerated.
Is there a lot of gang problems in Milwaukee?
I was we used to refer to Greendale as the bubble because, we were so removed from some of the violence and the crime in the city of Milwaukee. So definitely, I don't have any memory of any kind of gang activity in Greendale. I'm certainly there was some probably going on in Milwaukee. I mean, the one thing I do recall that definitely is gang would have been the outlaw motorcycle gang in Milwaukee. So that definitely was present, if not thriving, when I was a kid.
Yeah, they're still around. We
Yeah.
just saw one of their clubhouses.
Right, yeah, I've seen that. Yep.
Was your family very religious?
We were, so we definitely, as I said, went to St. Alphonsus. And my recollection is that until I was free to go to church on Sunday alone, we were 6 of us in the pew together. It was probably around sophomore year in high school that, if we wanted to go to Mass ourselves, and I did around that time, but the expectation was definitely from Mom and Dad that, yeah, we're going to let you go alone, but you better make sure that you go to church on Sunday.
Do you have any pictures of your family?
I do. So I brought a picture of my Russian grandfather, my Polish grandmother, and my dad. And looking at this picture, it looks like my dad is about 16 years old. So I think they were living in the house that we actually lived in when I was born. So they lived in a duplex, and we lived in the lower flat. I think pretty much right after my parents got married in 1949 until we moved to Greendale in 1959. And then I brought a childhood picture of my grandfather and grandmother on the day they got married. So that would have been in maybe 1920 or so, early 20s, because my mom was born in 1926. So she probably was born maybe 2 or 3 years after they got married. An interesting side story is the grandfather on my mom's side, his name is Alois Stravinsky, actually went to Marquette High School for a year. He was given a full scholarship that was given to him by his grade school because he was the top student in his 8th grade. But the scholarship was just good for 1 year. My grandfather, I think, had 13 siblings, so he came from a very large family. And after that 1 year, his parents couldn't afford to pay the tuition at Marquette High School. So I'm not sure where he ended up going, if he transferred to another Catholic high school or if he went to the public school. But I think he was, so not in this building, it wasn't built yet, in the old building up on the hill, I think on State Street, would have been in the late teens. So I think he was at Marquette High actually during the flu pandemic of the late teens, which is interesting.
Could you hold up some of the pictures and show the...
Sure. So this is a photograph of my grandmother, Marie, and my grandfather, Alois Stravinsky. And then, I'm sure you won't be able to pick this up, but this is the picture of my Russian grandfather and Polish grandmother and my dad. And then I did bring a picture of my great-grandfather and great-grandmother, who I actually never met, but he lived to 101, which is interesting. And then here's a photograph of my mom and dad on their wedding day, which would have been August of 1949.
So about the picture of your grandfather, where did you get the thing where he holds the picture?
This was on my mom and dad's dresser for decades. So when my mom moved from the house to a small apartment, she gave it to me. So I don't think the frame is real old. So my guess is that at some point my dad had the picture and he decided that, he wanted to put it on the dresser. So, because I don't have recollection of seeing that photograph when I was a little kid.
Yeah, that looks really interesting.
Yeah, so I knew my Polish grandmother really well because she lived to be 96. So that was about 1996 that she passed away.
Are you very close with her?
I was. So she always spoke broken English. So she never learned to speak English fluently. So there was a greater closeness when I was a little kid where communication wasn't as important. But then as I grew older, because of the communication barrier. And I wouldn't say that we had a drifting apart, but it was just a little more difficult to maintain relationship. I do remember one of the last things she ever said to me was that I reminded her so much of her Johnny, which was my grandfather's name. And when I thought back, I mean, I guess, I don't know if any of you guys are the youngest in the family. Okay. But we always argue, like, with our siblings, no, we're not spoiled because we're the youngest, but maybe I think we were as the youngest. So I look back and kind of think with my grandmother that, I was probably a little more spoiled by her than my 3 siblings.
Favorite?
My grandmother on my mom's side was born here in the States, and she was just a wonderful storyteller. So even as I grew older, I was drawn more and more to her stories because, you just all of a sudden realize in your teens and beyond that she's not going to be here forever. So make sure that you keep asking for stories. And I can remember, I think it was one of the last Christmases I spent with her. My mom was born on Christmas Day, so I can remember asking her that story of what that was like to give birth to her first child on Christmas Day, and that's just a really fond memory for me.
And then going back to high school, was it easy for you or was it difficult?
Yeah, I was a good student. So, I mean, I had to work for grades. My eldest sister and my brother, some of these students at Marquette High, and maybe you're one of them or you're certainly aware of them, where it seems like things just come really easy, right? You kind of look at them and think, oh my God, I wish I had, that kind of academic intelligence. And my brother and oldest sister were very much that way. So I remember that was kind of a tough gig for me, going to the same schools. And once teachers found out that, oh, you're the brother of Sue or the brother of Mark, there was kind of this expectation that I was going to be the same way. And I did get good grades, but I definitely had to work harder than. Yeah, my other sister, Pat, who's closer in age to me than Sue, she definitely had to work harder for grades as well. So.
When you were in high school, did you know right away what you wanted to do with your life?
I was, as long as I can remember, I always enjoyed time outdoors. So it was always a profession that would have taken me outdoors. So I can remember at one time wanting to be a national park ranger, another time wanting to work for the Department of Natural Resources here in Wisconsin. Eventually decided I was going to get my undergraduate and graduate degree in geology because, again, that was a job that would take you outdoors. It really wasn't until graduate school where I did some teaching as a graduate student that I started to think, maybe that's something I wanted to do long term.
After high school, what college did you go to?
I went to UW-Milwaukee, started out as a pre-med major, and then after about a year and a half, I decided I really didn't want to be a doctor. And that was so third semester I took an intro course in geology, and that's when I fell in love with geology. And then shortly after that semester, I declared my major in geology, and then ended up going to graduate school. At that time, it was the geoscience department at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Now it's still attached to the UW-Milwaukee system, but it's known as I think it's called the School of Freshwater Sciences now. So that's actually where I did my graduate studies.
Did you have any jobs during your high school and college years?
I did. So I My first job was actually as a bagger at a grocery store. And then that was junior year in high school. And then as a senior, I got a job as a shoe salesman in a shoe store. And then I did that through my undergraduate schooling. And then as a graduate student, I taught, as I said, and then I also worked as a research assistant at the School of Freshwater Sciences.
Was it hard to pay for college?
It wasn't, actually. So I pretty much through graduate school worked 25 hours a week, and I did live at home. I think I'm pretty certain my first semester tuition bill at UW-Milwaukee was less than $300 for the semester. And I still have some of the old books from my geology days that I would sometimes use as resources teaching here at Marquette. And I know there's some price tags in there of like $15 or $20. So, you know, education in those days was much, much more reasonable.
So during college, was there any black right movements going on that you were involved in?
I don't recall. I remember just between working 25 hours a week and my studies that was pretty much my focus.
Outside of, like after graduating, did you attend a lot of concerts?
So I did go to quite a few concerts in a high school at Summerfest. I did work as a geologist for Exxon in Houston for a year. I don't remember going to many concerts at that time. And then when I came back to Milwaukee and through the 80s into the 90s, teaching here at Marquette High, I also had a summer job in the accounting department at Summerfest. And so, I mean, I saw hundreds of concerts over that period of time.
What was the most memorable one?
I mean, I think my first concert I ever went to was a concert at Summerfest. I think it was 1970. I think it was the first year they were on the lakefront, the current location, and it was the rock group Chicago. So that was definitely memorable. I mean, other concerts that stand out, remember seeing Stevie Wonder here in Milwaukee, saw Marvin Gaye here in Milwaukee. Those are standouts. Rolling Stones. I mean, with so many concerts, it's hard to pick out, you know, one or two that are really standouts.
What was one of the most memorable moments that you had at Summerfest?
I mean, I was there for the 1970, I think it was 1973 riot where Humble Pie was playing. I wasn't a big Humble Pie fan, but some of my friends were, so I can remember, you know, let's go to Summerfest. I wasn't even aware that Humble Pie was playing because I wasn't interested. And I can even remember thinking, and even saying, nah, I don't think I want to go. I'm not into Humble Pie. And then, you know, my friends just saying, you know, who cares? Just come along for the experience. So I did, and I guess I'm glad I did because I did, you know, definitely have memories of that riot. Most memorable would be when the beer tents were coming down. So, you know, when the crowd really got unruly, my first recollection is, you know, the crowd's going to the beer tents to try and get free beer. The problem was, how do you know, if you don't have a tapper, how do you get into the kegs? So I do remember, I mean, some of those folks at the concert tearing wooden planks up off the seating and trying to get into the kegs by hitting that with the wood. I mean, the wood was just breaking, so it was just kind of funny at that point. So, I mean, I have two very clear recollections. Just feeling that that atmosphere was really funny because it wasn't violent at all. Like nobody was hitting each other, pushing each other. There was just this kind of delirious teenage crowd trying to get into the beer. And then all of a sudden there was this sort of hush and people turning around to look in a direction away from the stage. And then I can remember the line of Milwaukee police on horseback and then police with clubs, standing between the horses. And then I just thought, okay, this is now a totally different scene, and I want out now. So, my thought was, I'm not going to wait for something to happen. I'm going to get out of here. So I thought, I can either try and go the other way. There really wasn't an easy way out because the crowd was kind of pandemonium. So I can remember just sort of making this decision that I actually was going to head towards the police line. And as I was thinking that, I can remember watching the first tear gas canister sailing overhead. So kind of hear this whoosh sound as the canisters were leaving these guns that they had with big tubes, almost like a mortar, and then watching the tear gas canister hit the ground, this sort of cloud come up, and this happening over and over again. And then I can remember heading towards the police and having to go through this area that a tear gas canister had hit. And I can remember getting hit by that cloud and just dropping to my knees because I could do nothing but cough. My eyes were burning, they were tearing up, so I can remember just not seeing very well. And then when I sort of came to, by that time the police had moved forward, so then I definitely saw some space in the line, and I can remember sort of crawling through that space, getting through to the other side of the police line, and then eventually getting up. And I don't remember if I ran or walked, but by this time I had been totally separated from my group, and then just remember catching a bus back to Greendale. And
what happened to your group?
So, I don't have great recollection of that. I definitely remember getting together with a couple of the guys after, but I really don't remember their story.
Parents ever find out?
Yeah, I never told my parents that, and I don't know if it ever came up. I'm sure it was in the newspaper, and I can remember we definitely always got either the morning or evening newspaper, and my parents, certainly my dad, would have read that from cover to cover, but in those days it wasn't just my experience, but it was my friends as well. Unless you really got caught by the police, your parents, mine and part of it was definitely being the youngest. They, by that time, were definitely kind of giving me a pass, but a lot of my friends, definitely, unless something really went down, parents didn't ask a lot of questions. So.
Was underage drinking a problem in Milwaukee?
So when I was in high school, the legal age was 18. I didn't have my 18th birthday until the very end of my senior year. So I wasn't legal until the end of the year. Does that mean that everybody waited until they're legal? Absolutely not. But it was a very different way of kind of moving through that period of experimenting with alcohol because the legal age was 18. So it wasn't so much I'm 17, I've got to wait until I'm legal at 21. It was 18. So, I mean, I had many friends that did turn even already in December of senior year and then through the months to the end of the year. So it would have been definitely a different experience, I would guess, than now. Even when I came here to Marquette High School, I think it was only my first year. So that was 1983, 84. I mean, my recollection is maybe that was the last year where it was legal at 18. But I remember there definitely being issues here at Marquette High from time to time, and definitely at Greendale High School, that kids would, if it was open campus, that kids would go off campus and drink and then come back to class drunk. So that was definitely more of an issue when the legal age was 18.
Did you go out to a lot of parties?
I wasn't a big party person when I was in high school. I mean, I had a relatively small group. I had a group of guys that I hung out with at Greendale High School that were all my age. So that group was really not into partying. And then I had a group of friends that were my age plus or minus one that I hung out with in the neighborhood. And, we really weren't of the party type either.
What was one of the best memories that you have with your friend group?
Of my, I would guess, there's two guys that stand out my same age from grade school and high school. My buddy Bob and my buddy Jeff, and I'm still in contact with them. And just really fond memories are just kind of goofing off in school. We were all in German class together, and we ended up taking 4 years of German together. And we were definitely mischievous in German class and did get into, nothing more serious than what we called jug at Marquette High School, but sometimes I think that the justice was served for me anytime I had, students that were of that mischievous character at Marquette High School. In fact, my wife would remind me of that justice is being served because I was that way, especially in German class. So, I would say that those are probably some of my fondest memories are just those German class memories, and then hanging out. We used to go to, sporting events together, definitely hang out after school and on weekends also.
Was weed legal when you were growing up?
No. And, I never tried pot in high school, and it was probably, at least in part, a big part was probably this group of students that I hung out with. So, we were all National Honor Society, and not to say National Honor Society students didn't get into trouble, but maybe back in the day they were maybe a little more straight shooters. So maybe that, contributed to the fact that looking back, I was pretty much a straight shooter, other than the kind of mischievous stuff that, either I talked about with the snowballing or goofing around in class.
So what were some other social activities there in Milwaukee that you would go to with your friends?
So, I definitely have recollection of the Brewers coming to Milwaukee from Seattle, and definitely remember going to games with my friends. We paid, I mean, I think initially it was even like 50 cents for bleacher tickets. So if not 50 cents, $1, maybe bleacher tickets were $1, and general admission, this was in the old Milwaukee County Stadium, and huge section of it was general admission. So now at the current American Family Field, I mean, there's so many different levels of tickets, right? Back in those days, there was maybe, I think it was like lower box, upper box, mezzanine, general admission, and bleachers. So we typically would sit in the bleachers. Once we started to work, maybe general admission. So, I mean, I definitely have fond memories of going to Brewer games. And then Bucks games. I was a huge Milwaukee Bucks fan. From the time they came, I think they came in 68 or 69. Big deal when we drafted Lou Alcindor, who eventually changed his name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And I definitely remember waiting in line at the old Milwaukee Bucks ticket office. So they played in what was called the arena at that time, which is now, I think, the venue for the UW Milwaukee Panthers. I'm not sure what they call it now. But it was actually a great place to watch basketball. So, I mean, I can remember standing in line for tickets, especially playoff tickets, and went to some awesome playoff games. I mean, the pinnacle was the 1974 NBA championship game, 7th game, against the Boston Celtics. We won a very close 6th game in Boston to stay alive, so it was tied at 3-3. Everybody thought we were going to win the 7th game in Milwaukee, and I had tickets to that game. We were way up in the highest rafter seats, but mid-court, and we lost that game. That was just a heartbreaker for us. So I have very, very fond memories of both the Brewers and the Bucks. And then, as I mentioned, Summerfest. Definitely the Brewers run in the early 80s. Their 1982 appearance in the World Series. Very fond memories as well. And then, of course, the Packers in the 90s when Favre was quarterback. Those are very fond memories as well.
So what sport was more popular, basketball or baseball?
I mean, definitely in the early 70s it would have been basketball because the Bucks were just really playing well. And then in the early 80s, it would have flipped to the Brewers. And then, of course, everybody a big Packer fan in the 90s when Favre was quarterback.
So stay on the topic of basketball. How was Kareem's draft? Did it have any hype around it?
I mean, definitely not the hype that it has now. So, I mean, they even broadcast the drafts now, right? Not that I watched that, but you guys would know better than I. I mean, isn't the NFL draft just a big thing that they now have on TV? I mean, definitely it wasn't that big a deal. It was more probably reading about it in the newspaper or watching the local newscast. I mean, I can definitely remember, I think, if my recollection is right, that it was us, Milwaukee Bucks, and the Phoenix Suns. And I could be wrong on that, but there was a coin flip. And I want to say Milwaukee called tails, and I might be wrong on this. But, I mean, it was really a big deal when we won the flip of the coin. And then, because it was like, well, whoever won the flip is going to draft Lou Alcindor because he was being touted as, eventually becoming maybe the greatest basketball player of all time. So, I mean, everybody knew we literally were going to go from last place team to, definitely the playoffs. And the playoffs didn't involve as many teams as it involves now, not only in basketball, but football and baseball as well. And we did. I don't know what place we took that year that he was a rookie. So I think it was the following year. I want to say that he was a rookie in 1970. And then we worked out a trade to get Oscar Robertson, who's still considered one of the greatest basketball players of all time, certainly guards. So, everybody then felt that, we had that missing piece. Now we had Kareem, and we had somebody that could feed it to him, or if not feed it to him, that could take the shot himself. And this was, long before the three-point line. So I think it was the first year we had the big O, Oscar Robertson, that 1971 we won the NBA championship. And I don't think we lost a single game in the playoffs. We definitely swept. They were called the Washington Bullets at the time. I'm not sure what they are now. But we did sweep them in 4 games.
So it wasn't a shock that we won the
No.
championship?
What was a shock is that we didn't keep winning after that. So like I said, that was 71. 74, we got to the finals, the 7th game of the finals. And then, as I said earlier, everybody thought for sure bring the game back to Milwaukee in the 7th game that we were definitely going to win. But it didn't happen.
Were you at the game when they won?
I was not at the game in 71 because the first 2 games were played here, we won, and then the next 2 games we won in Washington. So they didn't win in Milwaukee, unfortunately. Otherwise, I probably would have been at the game.
Did you have a big celebration when they won?
I can't remember at home. I remember the next day at school. If the next day was a school day, whenever the next school day was definitely a big deal, especially with my buddies that played basketball. It would have been a big deal.
Are there any other big news things that have happened in the U.S. that have impacted Milwaukee?
Big things, just news-wise. One of my earliest recollections definitely is the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I was in 1st grade. I was at Ann Brewster Public Grade School, and it was a neighborhood school, so some of the kids went home for lunch. And the assassination, I think he was shot around noon, if I remember right, Central Time. Of course, rushed to the hospital. So I can remember one of the girls' classmates that did go home for lunch did come back, and we were all coming in from recess. And it's definitely like a freeze frame for me, one of those times you'll never forget. And I was just a little guy, 1st grade, and I definitely remember her saying that the president was shot. So we all filed in, and then shortly after that, they let us go home. So that was back in the day when most moms didn't work outside the home. So it wouldn't have been unusual to send everybody home because the assumption was that there was a parent at home. And I do remember going home and my mom was crying. I think by that time it had been announced that he had actually died, had been killed. So definitely remember that. And that was a big deal. I can remember at Mass that weekend. I can even remember prayers being said at Mass. So I think he was shot maybe on a Friday, if that's right.
So being so young, did that have any effect on you?
Definitely not. The biggest effect I would say is that was the first time I saw adults cry like that. So, and probably the first time I saw a male adult cry. And and that would have been at Mass on Sunday. And then the other thing, I mean, I think I could be confusing that I've seen the video clip so many times, but I'm pretty certain that I did see when Jack Ruby live on TV shot Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin of JFK. And that, even as a little kid, was like, what just happened? So they were moving him from, I think, one jail to another. And this guy out of the crowd came up to him, point blank, shot him in the stomach. And, you know, he ended up dying shortly after that. So that was big. I remember I didn't see it live for sure. In fact, I don't think I heard about it until the following morning. I think it was 1968 when Bobby Kennedy, Jack's brother, who was campaigning for the Democratic nomination, and he was shot. I think it was in San Francisco in 1968. And I remember that having an impact, again, sort of the feeling like, what is going on? And timeline isn't real clear for me. I think Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated after Bobby, but I could be wrong, right around that time for sure. And that was another, you know, event that was just, you know, everybody was glued to their TV set for that as well. So all of those things definitely were unsettling for me as a youngster. And I definitely remember thinking, as I thought about career and eventually did become a teacher, I just thought I wanted to do something that would definitely have a positive impact on society. So I thought teaching was, you know, a good way to fulfill that wish of mine. Sort of thinking that the only way things were going to get better is from, you know, everybody just deciding that they were going to, in whatever they did, try to make the world a better place.
Seeing all these videos of people getting shot, did that have any effect on your mindset of the world?
Definitely. I mean, between the violence in what was at that time referred to as the race riots, not only in Milwaukee but across the country, Vietnam War demonstrations, some of the bombings that went on, assassinations, the Manson murders in California around that same time. I mean, all of that was just a lot of violence, national violence, and some local violence to take in as a youngster. So I would have been between, so starting with Kennedy being assassinated in November 1963, I would have been 6 years old until the end of the Vietnam War. And I can remember when Saigon fell in April of '75, watching, I think we were watching that live, and the helicopters coming in off aircraft carriers, U.S. aircraft carriers, to the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and flying people off the roof of the embassy. And that was quite moving as well. I mean, that was chaos. And I remember they were broadcasting that. Like I said, my recollection is that was live. Or if not live, just shortly after that. So. And then that was around the time that the first Earth Day occurred. So now there was also this talk of, you know, if we don't kind of blow each other to smithereens, we're going to kill each other in pollution. So, I mean, I guess there was a lot to worry about as a youngster. And yet, you guys know at your age, you tend to be really resilient also at that age. So if it's not really impacting you directly, So that's why, directly sort of the worry of being drafted. But then when that was taken away, because sometimes I think back now, like I mentioned earlier, you think we're living kind of through the worst of it now in the way the country is divided. And yet, as I tell these stories, it's like, at least up to this point, currently or recently, we haven't been as violent as we were back in the 60s and 70s.
So like the protests for these big events, did they ever get out of hand?
Yeah, they definitely, I mean, what's the famous one? Kent State, when the National Guard were called in and they ended up shooting innocent college students. I forget how many were actually killed. So yeah, and there definitely was violence on the protesters' side also. I wouldn't say, my recollection is that, and maybe there were some people killed, but they seemed to be fairly peaceful for the most part. So when Kent State occurred, I mean, that was another sort of like, what is happening? Because, I mean, you can even watch the video. I mean, it wasn't as though the college students were, battling the National Guard. So, but again, that would have been from the perspective of a teenager. So, and then other news events. I definitely remember the resignation of Nixon. Ford becomes president. He loses to Jimmy Carter. And then the Iran hostage crisis. I think that happened in 78 or 79, maybe 79, fall of 79. And then that didn't end until after the election of 80, where Ronald Reagan did beat Jimmy Carter, and the hostages weren't released until, I think it was like minutes after Reagan was sworn into office in January of 1980. So I mean, definitely Iran timed that for a reason, to make a statement that they weren't going to do it until Ronald Reagan was president. Maybe, certainly in part out of fear that, Reagan's response might be more aggressive than Jimmy Carter was. And then the Gulf War of '91, definitely remember that. I mean, that was all live by that time. So that was like around the clock video of, mainly bombings in Iraq, precision bombings. So now these aircraft had, video cameras on them. So I mean, it was just surreal, to almost like watching a video game. And that's my recollection. And then personally for that one, I had a brother-in-law that fought in that war. Thankfully was not killed or wounded, but that was another big event. And then locally, 1993, the cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee. So crypto is a microscopic pathogen. And now they're almost certain that it washed into Lake Michigan and was taken in the intake pipes of the waterworks because of heavy rains in April in Wisconsin. Those rains would have washed livestock waste into the Milwaukee River, including these microscopic pathogens, cryptosporidium. Milwaukee River flows into Lake Michigan, and then, as I said, the pathogens were taken in. And what was interesting about that is, at that time, the Milwaukee water coming out of the tap was cloudy. So people were suspicious of that. That isn't normal, right? And the officials of the Milwaukee Water Works were saying, it's nothing to be concerned about. It's just suspended, tiny little suspended clay particles it's safe to drink. And then more and more people started to get sick. A lot of people, I think, in the end, over 500,000 people in Milwaukee County ended up getting sick from that, including myself. I can remember I lived out in Waukesha County and didn't drink Milwaukee water, but when I, came into work to teach here at Marquette High, drinking water from the tap, and it was cloudy. It didn't smell, it didn't taste funky, but within a day or two after drinking that cloudy water, just getting violently ill. And for most of us, the vast majority, within a few days, 2-3 days, you were over it. But it ended up killing, I think, over 50 people at least, maybe over 100 people in Milwaukee County that were immune system compromised people. So, I mean, tragically, it did actually cause some deaths. So Milwaukee Water Works got their act together and they changed their way of treating water, mainly the use of ozone as an agent to kill pathogens. So we now claim to have the cleanest water in Milwaukee, or in the world. And then the other big news event that stands out would be 9/11, of course. And that was a school day here at Marquette High. So the first tower was hit maybe roughly 9 o'clock Central Time. I was teaching. And then I can remember, I think I taught first period and was off second. And Mr. Cleary came in and said, have you heard that one of the towers in New York City was hit by an airplane? I mean, my first thought was, it's this small airplane that, somehow malfunctioned around the city, and whoever the pilot was lost control and crashed into the tower. So I can remember I had a monitor a TV in my room, and I turned the TV on, and they showed this video, and it wasn't a small plane, it was an airliner. And so they kept showing that over and over again. Every once in a while I would go to a live feed to show the fire, how severe the fire was in that tower. And I can remember Mr. Cleary and I standing there and still thinking that it was an accident at that point. And watching that fire, and the second tower takes a hit from an airliner. Live. We were watching it live. And then instantly you thought, there's no way that could be an accident twice within minutes of each other, and then thinking, oh my God, what's going on? I'm quite certain they didn't dismiss class early that day, but of course then there was the concern after a plane hit the Pentagon, and there was another plane that actually the passengers rushed the cockpit and then somewhat took control over the plane, at least enough to crash it in a farm field in Pennsylvania. But then really for the rest of the day, at least for hours after that, there was this heightened level of just great anxiety that there were other rogue planes out there that were going to, crash into other big populated or dangerous sites, like they were talking about that maybe they had targeted nuclear power plants. So, it was just high anxiety until it was announced that, every passenger plane now was out of the air in the United States, and, but then it was this long sort of constantly watching the news. I don't know if you guys have had any event in your life where it's constant, news on the TV of an event, but definitely 9/11 stands out as one of those big events for me. And then, of course, everybody's talking about it everywhere, including Marquette High School.
So going back to the outbreak, so we saw how COVID-19 really made hospitals step up their game, and it was causing a lot of stress. Did the outbreak do the same?
Yeah, that's a good question. So nothing at all like COVID. So most people, sort of like a stomach flu, right? 24 hours, 48 hours, and it's done. That was pretty much what it was for crypto, unless you were, immune compromised. Then it could be something serious. And then definitely a number of those people ended up in the hospital, but it never got to a point where it was overwhelming the hospitals. Yeah.
What age were you during the Black Right movements?
During the recent, or are you referring to the race riots of the 60s?
Race riots.
Yeah, the race riots of the 60s, I think occurred in Milwaukee either in 67 or 68. So I would have been 10 or 11. And again, the recollection for me would have been on the nightly news to see that, not only locally, but nationally in the big cities. So the only other recollection I would have had of that is that I think for a while in Milwaukee County there was a sundown curfew. So when I was a kid, there was a countywide curfew at, I think it was 11 o'clock. So if you were under the age of 18 and you were caught out on the streets after 11 o'clock, you could be arrested. And I think it was countywide. We definitely had to be home by 11 o'clock. Not the sort of thing that if you were at your friend's house just down the block, but you couldn't really be out or about. If it was job related, yes. But if you were just kind of out hanging around, my recollection is that the police would stop and say, you need to get home now. It wasn't like they were going to arrest a 15-year-old kid. But the other thing I remember with this, which is looking back on it now is kind of comical, is if you were watching TV, which was very different than it is now, right? Everything's streamed now. So back in those days, there were 3 major TV stations, and you were watching something at 11 o'clock. I think the announcement came on at maybe 10:55, and the announcement was, parents, do you know it's 10:55? Do you know where your children are? And it would cut in every single day at that time, or maybe it was right at 11 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock, parents, do you know where your children are? So curfew was just part of our lives, but sundown curfew was very different. So I do have a recollection of that. And I do remember some buildings burning in Milwaukee during that time, seeing that on TV as well. But again, being a young kid on the far south side, Greendale, we were very, very separated from what was going on in the city of Milwaukee.
So, was your everyday life different during those times? So, like, if you were going to go on a walk, would it be advised to not even go on that walk?
During that time?
Yeah, during the riot.
During the day, I would say I don't have any recollection of any kind of restrictions on us. So the only restriction would have been that sundown curfew, that we were definitely at home. Or, you know, if we were hanging out with friends, it was right next door within a couple of houses. So I don't really have recollection of feeling like we were in any sort of danger, really. Well, it was a joy to do this with you guys.
No, we enjoyed that.
This concludes our oral history on December 14th, 2023.